The checkout line at Miller's Corner had gone dead silent. A young woman with a refined British accent fumbled through an empty designer wallet, her fingers trembling against cracked leather. "I'm so sorry. My cards were stolen at the bus station. I have no cash." The teenage cashier shrugged with practiced indifference. "No money. No food, lady." Behind her, impatient customers shifted their weight, grocery carts rattling like distant thunder. Her mud-caked Louboutin heels clicked against worn linoleum as she stepped back, clutching a water bottle and sandwich. The expensive watch hidden beneath her torn sleeve caught fluorescent light for just a moment. When Connor McKay moved forward, his 8-year-old daughter Mia tugging at his work shirt, he placed a crumpled $20 bill on the counter without hesitation. "Add hers to mine." The woman's eyes locked onto his, not with grateful relief, but with sharp recognition, as if she knew something about him that he had no idea about himself. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her kitchen window as Connor loaded groceries into his rusted pickup truck, the same vehicle he'd driven to Sarah's funeral 3 years ago. She remembered that day, how he'd carried sleeping Mia while neighbors brought casseroles nobody ate, his calloused hands trembling as he accepted sympathy cards from people who meant well but couldn't fill the void that cancer had carved from their lives. McKay Auto Repair sat like a weathered monument on Main Street, its faded sign competing with the gleaming auto zone that had opened last spring with promises of faster service and lower prices. Connor's daily rhythm never varied. Black coffee in Sarah's chipped mug, lunch packed in containers she'd once filled with notes that said, "Love you," in purple ink. Dinner conversations where Mia's endless chatter filled the silence their mother had left behind. The man had learned to braid hair from internet videos, attended every parent-teacher conference alone, his oversized frame folding into chairs designed for much smaller people. Mia pressed her nose against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Connor help the strange woman with her torn sleeve and expensive shoes. Her winter coat came from the thrift store on River Road, its elbows carefully mended with patches that almost matched the original fabric. Connor's handiwork during late-night mending sessions when he thought she was asleep. Friday tradition meant sharing one chocolate chip cookie at Martha's Bakery, 2 people splitting sweetness because their budget stretched thin between mortgage payments and medical bills that insurance hadn't covered. The woman followed them outside, her designer heels clicking against cracked sidewalk like expensive music played on broken instruments. "Excuse me?" she called, her accent turning heads among the grocery store crowd that rarely heard anything more exotic than tourists heading to the state park. Connor paused automatically, his hand moving to Mia's shoulder in a protective gesture so natural it spoke of countless moments when the world felt too big and dangerous for just the two of them. "I'm Liv Bennett," the woman said, extending a manicured hand that trembled slightly despite her composed expression. "My rental car broke down on Highway 380, about 5 miles outside town. My phone's completely dead, and I've missed my connection with my tour group." Connor studied her face, noting the way her eyes darted toward his truck's license plate, then back to his weathered features with unusual intensity, as if memorizing details for some purpose he couldn't fathom. Mia tugged his sleeve, whispering loud enough for half the parking lot to hear. "Daddy, why does she talk like the lady in that princess movie?" The woman's laugh came too quickly, too bright, like someone trying to convince herself of her own performance rather than entertaining a child. "I just need to get to a motel, if you could point me in the right direction. I can pay for gas money, of course." But when Connor mentioned the Riverside Inn, her expression shifted from relief to something that looked suspiciously like calculation, as if she was processing information rather than simply grateful for assistance. The drive to the motel stretched through downtown Cedar Falls, past storefronts that had weathered decades of economic storms with the stubborn persistence of Midwestern optimism. Liv sat in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming against the door handle, while her eyes catalogued every building, every empty lot, every sign of struggle or prosperity with the systematic attention of someone conducting a survey rather than admiring scenery. "This is a charming town," she said, but her tone suggested she was taking inventory rather than making conversation, her gaze lingering on property lines and architectural details with professional interest. At the Riverside Inn, the desk clerk's apologetic shrug told the story before words did. Harvest Festival weekend meant every room booked solid until Monday morning, leaving stranded travelers with few options. Mia bounced in the truck bed, her face pressed against the rear window as she called out, "She can stay with us, Daddy. Remember when Grandma got stuck in that snowstorm last winter? You said helping people is what Mommy would want us to do." The innocent suggestion hung in the air between them, weighted with the kind of moral obligation that children invoke without understanding the complications they're creating. Connor's jaw tightened as he weighed pride against his daughter's innocent wisdom, knowing that his bank account barely stretched to cover their own expenses without adding a house guest to the equation. The spare room still smelled like baby powder and crayon wax, its walls covered with Mia's artwork from when she was too young to understand that families could disappear without warning or explanation. "Just for tonight," he said finally, noting how Liv's shoulders relaxed in a way that seemed disproportionate to solving a simple accommodation problem, as if this temporary arrangement served purposes beyond mere convenience. During the short drive home, she made a phone call that sounded more like coded military instructions than casual conversation with worried friends or family members. "Plans have changed. Timeline requires adjustment. I'll make contact when the local situation becomes clearer." Her fingers worried the edge of her torn sleeve, revealing glimpses of that expensive watch, a Cartier that probably cost more than Connor made in 6 months, creating contradictions she didn't seem aware she was broadcasting to anyone paying attention. The McKay house sat on Elm Street like a comfortable old sweater, its paint slightly faded, but its bones solid enough to weather whatever storms life decided to throw at small-town Iowa families. Connor carried Liv's single piece of luggage, a leather weekend bag that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget, while Mia raced ahead to flip on lights and announce their arrival to the empty rooms. The living room still held traces of Sarah's presence, like museum exhibits nobody had the heart to relocate. Family photos on the mantel showing happier times, a half-finished cross-stitch project abandoned on the side table when chemotherapy made her fingers too weak to hold the needle, books marked with grocery receipts she'd used as bookmarks because buying proper ones seemed wasteful. Liv's gaze lingered on these details with the intensity of someone cataloguing evidence rather than admiring domestic decorations, her eyes moving from photograph to photograph as if building a psychological profile. "You have a lovely family," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth that made Connor's correction land like a physical blow. "Had. My wife passed away 3 years ago." The past tense sat between them like an uninvited guest, reshaping the entire conversation into something more fragile than either of them had anticipated. Mia appeared with an armload of toy cars, her enthusiasm undampened by adult undercurrents she couldn't quite grasp, but sensed hovering around the edges of every interaction. "Want to see my collection? Daddy fixes real cars at his shop, but these are my special ones that nobody else gets to touch." She spread the miniature vehicles across the coffee table with the precision of someone who'd inherited an eye for mechanical details, each car positioned according to some internal logic that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old mind. Liv knelt beside her, running expert fingers over the die-cast models, with surprising knowledge that went far beyond casual appreciation for well-made toys. "This one's a 1967 Mustang," she murmured, then caught herself immediately, backtracking with unconvincing casualness. "I mean, I think it might be. I'm not really sure about car models and years and things like that." But her assessment had been absolutely perfect, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew automotive history intimately, and Connor filed that contradiction away with all the others that were starting to accumulate around their unexpected house guest, like puzzle pieces waiting for someone to arrange them into a recognizable picture. The storm that rolled in that evening matched the one brewing in Connor's chest as he watched Liv help Mia with homework at the kitchen table, where he and Sarah had planned their future and paid their bills and argued about money during the lean years. Her explanations of fraction problems came with the confidence of someone accustomed to breaking down complex concepts for others, and her pronunciation corrections carried the subtle authority of expensive private education. When Mia struggled with vocabulary words, Liv's patience never wavered, but her phone buzzed constantly with messages she read quickly before deleting, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Important work?" Connor asked, setting down 3 cups of hot chocolate, a luxury he'd stretched his budget to afford because their guest deserved proper hospitality, even if he couldn't quite afford it. "Something like that," Liv replied, but her fingers paused over the screen in a way that suggested the messages carried weight, far beyond casual correspondence with friends or family members checking on her welfare during this supposed travel emergency. After Mia went to bed, Connor found Liv standing in the living room, studying Sarah's bookshelf with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts for clues about a vanished civilization. "She liked mysteries," he said, making Liv jump slightly as if she'd been so absorbed in her investigation that she'd forgotten she wasn't alone. Always trying to solve the puzzle before the last chapter, getting frustrated when authors played fair and gave her all the clues she needed. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched this mysterious woman handle Sarah's copy of an Agatha Christie novel, her manicured nails a stark contrast to the book's worn spine and dog-eared pages. "I'm sorry for your loss," Liv said, and for the first time since they'd met, her voice carried genuine emotion rather than the careful politeness of someone managing a social obligation. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and Connor realized that whatever weather front was approaching, it was going to trap this woman in his house for longer than either of them had originally planned. Something about that prospect made him nervous in ways he couldn't quite articulate, as if her extended presence might complicate his carefully ordered life in directions he wasn't prepared to navigate. The next morning brought grey skies and the kind of steady rain that turns dirt roads into impassable rivers and traps people in whatever shelter they'd found the night before. Connor discovered Liv already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the speed of someone conducting important business rather than killing time until travel became possible. Her screen snapped shut the moment he appeared, but not before he glimpsed what looked like architectural drawings and rows of financial figures that seemed wildly out of place for someone supposedly stranded by car trouble. "Early riser," he commented, noting the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much, despite the comfortable bed and quiet house. "Occupational hazard," she replied, then immediately looked like she regretted the phrase, as if it revealed more about her actual circumstances than she'd intended. When Mia stumbled downstairs in her dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes with tiny fists, Liv's entire demeanor shifted from business-like efficiency to genuinely warm maternal instincts. A transformation so complete, it felt like watching someone remember how to be human after years of practicing to be something else entirely. The bank notice arrived with Tuesday's mail, its certified delivery stamp marking it as the kind of correspondence that changes everything, regardless of whether the recipient is prepared for such changes. Connor signed for it while Liv helped Mia build a blanket fort in the living room, their laughter creating a cruel soundtrack to the words that hammered reality home with bureaucratic precision. 60 days overdue, foreclosure proceedings authorized, $12,000 required immediately. The paper trembled in his hands as he calculated months of struggling against medical bills and declining business against this impossible deadline that would strip away everything his father had built. Behind him, Mia's delighted squeal as their blanket fort collapsed seemed to come from another universe where fathers didn't fail at providing basic security for their children, where single parents didn't lie awake at night wondering if love was enough to overcome mathematical realities. Connor folded the notice carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket where it sat like a lead weight against his ribs, heavy with the knowledge that his time for fixing this particular problem was measured in weeks rather than months or years. Liv emerged from the fort looking disheveled and genuinely happy for the first time since Connor had met her, her expensive hair mussed by children's games and her designer clothes wrinkled from crawling around on the floor with someone else's daughter. "She's absolutely brilliant," she said, watching Mia gather materials for an even more ambitious architectural project involving kitchen chairs and every sheet in the house. "Reminds me of myself at that age, always building things and taking them apart to see how they worked." The comment slipped out naturally, revealing glimpses of a childhood that sounded far removed from tour groups and broken-down rental cars. But Connor caught the way her expression tightened immediately afterward, as if she'd revealed more than intended. Her phone rang then, a sharp electronic sound that cut through their domestic warmth like a blade, and the conversation she conducted in rapid, clipped sentences belonged to a different person entirely from the one who'd been building forts moments before. "I need more time for proper assessment. The local situation is proving more complex than our initial intelligence suggested." When she hung up, Mia was watching with the perceptive eyes of a child who'd learned too young that adults carry burdens they don't discuss with 8-year-olds, no matter how much those burdens weigh on everyone in the household. By Wednesday, the fiction of a stranded tourist had worn thin around the edges like a favorite shirt that's been washed too many times. Expensive packages arrived daily with different names on the labels: L. Ashworth, O. Bennett, Victoria Sterling, a collection of identities that suggested either identity theft or someone maintaining multiple personas for reasons Connor couldn't begin to guess. Liv explained them as replacement items from insurance claims, her stories growing more elaborate with each delivery, but Connor noticed how she received each package with the familiarity of someone expecting exactly what arrived, rather than the grateful surprise of someone getting unexpected assistance. Her knowledge of automotive repair became impossible to dismiss as coincidental when she diagnosed a carburetor problem that had stumped him for weeks, her hands moving around engine parts with the confidence of extensive experience rather than casual observation. "Lucky guess," she said when he stared at her in amazement, but her explanation felt as fabricated as everything else about her supposed circumstances. The contradictions were piling up like evidence in a case he didn't want to solve, each new detail making her presence in his house feel less like coincidence and more like something planned for purposes he was afraid to discover. The town gossip network activated with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed specifically for processing and distributing information about unusual occurrences in places where unusual rarely happened. Mrs. Henderson cornered Connor at the hardware store, her voice pitched low with the urgency of someone sharing classified intelligence rather than small-town speculation. "That woman's got expensive tastes and mysterious money, mark my words. Girls like that don't end up stranded in places like Cedar Falls unless they're running from something or towards something, and either way it's trouble." Tommy Walsh from the competing garage spread rumors about Connor's sugar mama arrangement with the persistence of someone who'd found a weapon and intended to use it until maximum damage was achieved. Even Mia's school principal called, mentioning that she seemed distracted lately, asking questions about whether having a new person in their house meant her daddy might disappear too, the way some of her classmates' fathers had when new women entered the picture. The weight of community scrutiny pressed against Connor's shoulders like a physical thing, made heavier by his own growing suspicions about their houseguest, and what her real purpose might be in a town that had nothing obvious to offer someone with her apparent resources. Thursday brought the kind of autumn weather that made Cedar Falls look like a postcard sent from some idealized version of small-town America. Golden leaves dancing on crisp air, the smell of wood smoke from chimneys, children's laughter echoing from the elementary school playground where Mia spent her afternoons. But Connor's appreciation for seasonal beauty dissolved when he found Liv's laptop left open on the kitchen counter, its screen displaying an email with the subject line that made his blood freeze. Cedar Falls Downtown Acquisition. Phase 1 complete. His hands shook as he read fragments of corporate language, references to property values and development timelines, before the sound of Liv's footsteps on the stairs sent him stepping quickly away from evidence he wasn't supposed to see. When she appeared, her casual question about coffee plans couldn't quite hide the sharp way her eyes moved from his face to the laptop and back again, measuring his expression for signs that he'd seen something that would complicate whatever game she was playing. The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap, both of them aware that secrets were becoming impossible to maintain, but neither willing to be the first to acknowledge that their entire relationship had been built on carefully constructed lies. The confrontation came that evening after Mia had gone to bed, the air between them thick with unspoken accusations and the kind of tension that made breathing feel difficult. Connor held printed pages, social media photos Tommy Walsh had triumphantly delivered like evidence in a criminal trial, showing a woman who looked exactly like Liv at London charity galas, surrounded by business executives in suits that cost more than most people's cars. Ashworth Industries CEO announces major expansion, read the partially visible headline from what appeared to be a financial newspaper covering events in a world far removed from small-town Iowa. Liv's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise at being discovered, resignation at the inevitable end of her deception, and finally, something that looked almost like relief at no longer having to maintain pretenses that had clearly been exhausting her. "How long have you known?" she asked, her accent somehow more pronounced now that the need for careful disguise was crumbling around them like a house built on inadequate foundations. "Known what, exactly?" Connor's voice carried the strain of a man trying to hold his world together with increasingly inadequate adhesive, while everything he thought he understood shifted beneath his feet. The truth spilled out in fragments that reshaped everything Connor thought he understood about the past week and the woman who'd been sharing his kitchen table and helping his daughter with homework. Olivia Ashworth, not Liv Bennett. CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that specialized in strategic acquisitions and urban development projects that transformed struggling communities into profitable enterprises. Cedar Falls had been marked for development that would bring jobs and economic opportunities while simultaneously erasing most of what made the town recognizable to people who'd lived there for generations. Connor's garage, Mrs. Rodriguez's diner, the hardware store where he'd bought his first tools, all scheduled for demolition to make way for an automated manufacturing facility that would employ hundreds but require destroying the downtown district to build. "I came to oversee the acquisition personally," Olivia said, her words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of their small community. To make sure the transition was handled with appropriate sensitivity, that people were treated fairly during the process. The qualifier carried the weight of someone who'd convinced herself that destroying communities could be done humanely if you used the right legal language and wrote sufficiently large checks to ease the pain of displacement. But something fundamental had changed during her time in Cedar Falls, Olivia explained, her corporate composure cracking to reveal vulnerability that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Connor. Watching his devotion to Mia had reminded her of her own childhood, raised by a single father who'd built his automotive empire from nothing after losing his wife in a car accident that left him to raise a daughter alone. She'd inherited Ashworth Industries at 25 when her father died suddenly of a heart attack, spent the next 15 years proving herself in a male-dominated industry by becoming more ruthless and efficient than any of the men who'd initially dismissed her as a pretty face playing with daddy's money. "I forgot what it felt like to be part of something real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she struggled to articulate emotions she'd spent years suppressing in boardrooms where sentiment was weakness. "This house, Mia's laughter, the way you fix things instead of throwing them away and buying replacements. It's everything I lost when I stopped being a person and became a position on an organizational chart." Her confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they trusted enough to cross, spanning the gap between his world of honest work and hers of corporate power, with uncertainty about whether such different realities could ever truly connect. The corporate lawyers arrived Friday morning like harbingers of an inevitable apocalypse, their black town car looking absurdly out of place on Elm Street, where the most expensive vehicle was usually Connor's 15-year-old pickup truck. Connor watched from his kitchen window as they unloaded briefcases and tablets, their movements efficient and impersonal as they prepared to deliver legal documents that would reshape his life whether he wanted such changes or not. The lead attorney carried papers that would offer Connor $200,000 for his property, enough to secure Mia's college fund and start over somewhere cheaper where the cost of living might allow a single father to provide better opportunities for his daughter. The alternative, delivered in language polished by expensive law schools and designed to minimize liability while maximizing compliance, was eminent domain proceedings that would pay a fraction of the property's value and strip away any choice in the matter. Connor's hands trembled as he signed acknowledgement of receipt, knowing that somewhere in those legal documents lay the death certificate for everything his father had built and everything he'd hoped to pass on to his own daughter. The weight of generations pressed against his shoulders as he realized that his decision would determine whether the McKay family legacy continued or ended with him. Word spread through Cedar Falls with the speed of small-town communication networks operating at peak efficiency, carrying news of the proposed development like wildfire through drought-dry prairie grass. The emergency town meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening at the community center, the same building where Connor and Sarah had attended high school dances and where Mia had performed in her first kindergarten play about vegetables learning to share. Hardware store owner Bill Martinez faced the same impossible choice, as did Mrs. Rodriguez with her diner that had served 3 generations of Cedar Falls families through celebrations and tragedies alike. The daycare center where Connor had dropped off baby Mia during Sarah's chemotherapy treatments was also marked for demolition, its playground equipment and finger-painted artwork scheduled to become casualties of progress and economic development. Economic opportunity versus historical preservation became the battle lines around which the community would either unite in common purpose or fracture beyond repair along divisions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The irony wasn't lost on Connor that the woman who'd brought this crisis to their doorstep was also the only person with enough power to potentially resolve it in their favor, if she could find the courage to choose their small community over the corporate empire she'd spent her adult life building. Mia's world began crumbling in ways that 8-year-old comprehension couldn't quite process, but emotional intelligence felt with devastating completeness. She overheard fragments of adult conversations, caught the tension in her father's shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking, noticed how Olivia's smiles had become forced and fleeting, rather than the genuine warmth she'd shown during their first few days together. The breaking point came when she found Connor sitting at Sarah's grave, his head in his hands and shoulders shaking with the weight of impossible choices that seemed designed to hurt everyone he loved. "Daddy, are you going to disappear too?" The question hit him like a physical blow, followed by her tearful confession that kids at school were saying mean things about the fancy lady living in their house, wondering if that meant her daddy was going to leave the way some of their daddies had, when new women complicated family situations. Her fear of abandonment, rooted in memories of watching her mother fade away despite all the medical interventions and prayers, and desperate bargaining with a universe that seemed determined to take away everyone she depended on, crystallized everything Connor had been struggling to understand about what really mattered. The realization that his daughter's sense of security was more important than property values or community heritage, or even his father's legacy, hit him with the force of revelation, reshaping his understanding of what he was actually fighting to preserve. Connor's conversation with his daughter among the weathered headstones became the kind of moment that reshapes a person's fundamental understanding of what constitutes success and failure in the business of living. He explained about hard choices and uncertain futures, about how sometimes loving someone means making decisions that hurt in the short term, but protect what's most important over the long haul. Mia listened with the solemn attention of a child who'd already learned that life could change without warning or explanation, then surprised him with wisdom that seemed too large for her small frame and pigtails and grass-stained sneakers. "Mommy always said that home isn't a place on a map. It's people who love each other and take care of each other no matter what happens. So if we stay together, we're still home wherever we go, right?" The simplicity of her logic cut through weeks of agonizing over property values and community heritage to the essential truth underneath all his complicated adult reasoning. Home was wherever he and Mia were together, whether that was in the house where she'd been born or some apartment in a different state where they'd have to start over from scratch. The weight of that realization was both liberating and terrifying, freeing him from obligations to the past while simultaneously forcing him to confront an uncertain future with nothing but love and determination as navigation tools. Saturday evening's town meeting packed the community center beyond its intended capacity. Folding chairs arranged in tight rows, while latecomers stood along the walls like witnesses to history in the making. Connor sat in the front row with Mia beside him, her small hand tucked into his calloused palm, as neighbors and friends waited to hear how he would represent their collective future to a room full of people whose lives hung in the balance. The weight of their trust felt heavier than any engine he'd ever lifted, their faces reflecting the same mixture of hope and resignation that he'd been carrying since Tuesday's bank notice arrived like a death sentence for everything they'd built together. Behind them sat families who'd been in Cedar Falls for generations, their roots extending deep into Iowa soil that had nourished their grandparents and great-grandparents through depressions and wars and all the smaller disasters that test communities' commitment to taking care of their own. Olivia sat in the back corner with her corporate lawyers flanking her like expensive bookends, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting someone preparing for battle or surrender in equal measure. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the persistence of insects, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look older and more fragile than they actually were. Connor approached the microphone with the measured steps of someone walking toward his own execution, each footfall echoing in the suddenly silent room where even crying babies seemed to understand that important business was being conducted. The opening words of his prepared speech about heritage and community values felt inadequate against the magnitude of what hung in the balance, but his voice grew stronger as he talked about his father's legacy and the importance of places where children could grow up, knowing their neighbors' names and feeling safe enough to ride bicycles after dark. Halfway through his remarks about the value of continuity in an increasingly disconnected world, Olivia stood up with the sudden decisiveness of someone who'd been wrestling with conscience and finally chosen a side in a battle that would define the rest of her life. Every head turned as she walked to the front of the room, her expensive heels clicking against worn linoleum, in rhythm with the community center's collective held breath and the sound of hearts beating fast enough to be audible in the sudden silence. Her corporate lawyers exchanged glances that suggested this development was definitely not part of their prepared strategy for managing what should have been a routine acquisition announcement followed by damage control and public relations management. "I need to say something before Connor continues," Olivia announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms where millions of dollars changed hands based on quarterly reports and profit projections, but tempered with something softer. Humanity that had been buried under years of corporate armor, but never completely extinguished. The lawyers behind her shifted uncomfortably in chairs that suddenly seemed too small for the magnitude of whatever decision their client was about to announce to a room full of people whose lives would be affected by her next words. Connor stepped aside, his eyes meeting hers for a moment that seemed to contain entire conversations about trust, sacrifice, and the possibility of choosing love over profit when the two came into direct conflict. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Cedar Falls and its 3,000 residents, but whether redemption was possible for someone who'd spent 15 years becoming exactly the kind of person she'd once promised her dying father she'd never become. The weight of that promise, made in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, pressed against her chest as she prepared to announce a decision that would either destroy her career or finally allow her to sleep peacefully for the first time in years. Olivia's announcement hit the packed community center like a thunderclap that left ears ringing and minds struggling to process information that seemed too good to be true. Ashworth Industries was withdrawing from the Cedar Falls acquisition completely, she declared, her voice steady, despite the visible shock registering on her corporate lawyers' faces as they realized their client was committing financial suicide in front of 300 witnesses. Instead of demolition and redevelopment, the company would establish a $50 million heritage preservation fund designed to modernize infrastructure while maintaining the town's historical character and economic independence. Connor felt his knees go weak as the implications washed over him like water breaking through a dam he'd built from desperation and determination. His garage saved, the community preserved, Mia's stability protected, his father's legacy secured for another generation. But as he watched Olivia face the crowd with chin raised and shoulders squared against whatever corporate retaliation awaited her in London, he realized that her salvation of Cedar Falls might have just cost her everything she'd built over the past 15 years. The applause that erupted from the community center sounded like a celebration and a funeral simultaneously, marking the birth of new possibilities and the death of old certainties in equal measure. The corporate retaliation was swift and merciless, arriving with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically for crushing executives who allowed personal feelings to interfere with fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders and board members. Emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning London time. Vote of no confidence already being organized by directors who'd flown in specifically to witness what they assumed would be a routine small-town demolition followed by groundbreaking ceremonies and profit projections. Olivia accepted Connor's offer to stay through the weekend with the resignation of someone who understood that her penthouse apartment overlooking the Thames might no longer be available by Tuesday, depending on how thoroughly her former colleagues decided to destroy her professional reputation. She helped Mia with math homework at the kitchen table, where they'd spent so many evenings establishing routines that felt more like family than anything she'd experienced since childhood. But her phone remained ominously silent, corporate communications channels closing around her like a slowly tightening noose designed to strangle careers rather than necks. Connor found himself watching her with growing admiration for someone who'd sacrificed a billion-dollar empire to save a town that most people couldn't find on a map, wondering if he would have possessed similar courage when faced with choosing between personal security and doing what felt morally right. Mrs. Rodriguez organized the Welcome Home Olivia celebration with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades feeding people through their worst and best moments, understanding that food was how small communities expressed emotions too large for words. The diner filled with neighbors who'd heard fragments of the story, through the Cedar Falls communication network and wanted to express gratitude, they didn't quite know how to articulate to someone who'd given up everything to save their way of life. Olivia sat in the corner booth, the same one where Connor had brought Sarah on their first official date 20 years ago. Accepting thanks from people whose names she was still learning, but whose faces had become precious to her in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Bill Martinez from the hardware store shook her hand with the grip of someone whose livelihood had been hanging by a thread until Friday evening's miraculous reprieve. The daycare director hugged her with tears streaming down weathered cheeks, understanding that dozens of families would continue to have safe places for their children because of this woman's impossible choice. Even Tommy Walsh appeared, his earlier antagonism replaced by grudging respect for someone who'd proven that actions mattered more than origins when it came to earning acceptance in a place where trust had to be built rather than bought. The Heritage Fund's implementation became a community-wide project that gave everyone something constructive to focus on instead of dwelling on how close they'd come to losing everything that made Cedar Falls feel like home, rather than just another dot on interstate highway maps. Connor's garage received state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment that made his decades of experience even more valuable, while the apprenticeship program connected local teenagers with automotive careers that could support families without requiring college degrees they couldn't afford or didn't want. Downtown facades got restored to their 1920s glory, while modern infrastructure ran invisibly beneath sidewalks that had witnessed 3 generations of Cedar Falls residents celebrating graduations and mourning losses and falling in love with people they'd known since childhood. The small business incubator occupied the renovated building where Connor's father had first learned to repair engines during the Great Depression, creating a circle of economic history that felt like destiny instead of coincidence. Local contractors worked alongside specialists from Chicago and Des Moines, sharing knowledge that bridged generational gaps and proved that progress didn't require abandoning everything that had worked well for decades. Winter settled over Cedar Falls with the kind of snow globe perfection that made even long-time residents pause to appreciate their surroundings, instead of taking beauty for granted the way people do when they see the same landscapes every day. Connor and Olivia developed routines that felt natural despite their unusual origins: morning coffee while Mia got ready for school, evening walks through downtown streets where Christmas lights reflected off snow-covered sidewalks like fallen stars, quiet conversations on the couch after Mia went to bed, and they could finally acknowledge the attraction that had been building between them since those first days when trust was impossible, but connection felt inevitable. The lawyer's final verdict had been surprisingly lenient. Olivia retained her CEO position, but with oversight committee restrictions that essentially neutered her ability to make unilateral decisions about acquisitions and development projects. She accepted the compromise with grace that suggested relief rather than disappointment, as if she'd been carrying the weight of absolute power longer than she'd ever intended, and was grateful to share responsibility with people who might occasionally prioritize community welfare over quarterly profit reports. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of optimism that makes people believe in fresh starts and second chances and the possibility that past mistakes don't have to determine future outcomes. 3 months after that first encounter in Miller's Corner, Connor found himself standing in his garage beside restored equipment that hummed with efficient precision, surrounded by tools that connected 4 generations of automotive expertise in an unbroken chain of knowledge passed from father to son to granddaughter. The framed photograph on his workbench showed Olivia's grandfather in his original Chicago auto shop, surrounded by tools that looked remarkably similar to the ones Connor used daily, proving that some things transcended geography and time and corporate acquisitions. Mia had taken to spending afternoons learning basic automotive repair, her questions showing the same mechanical curiosity that had driven their combined families to build something lasting from nothing but determination and skill and willingness to get their hands dirty solving other people's problems. When the young single mother arrived with her broken-down sedan and empty wallet, Connor's response came automatically: begin diagnostic work, while Olivia quietly arranged a payment plan that preserved dignity along with solving practical transportation problems. The town meeting anniversary arrived with spring flowers blooming along Main Street and the kind of soft evening light that made everything look like it was posed for a painting about the beauty of ordinary American communities. Connor and Olivia sat on their front porch swing, the same one where Sarah had announced her pregnancy 8 years ago, and where he'd spent countless sleepless nights wondering if love was enough to keep a family together when medical bills threatened to destroy everything they'd built. They watched Mia practice bicycle tricks on the sidewalk with the fearless confidence of childhood that believes in happy endings and second chances and the possibility that adults might occasionally make decisions based on what feels right instead of what seems practical. "Do you think he'd approve?" Olivia asked, touching the photograph of her grandfather that she now carried in her wallet like a talisman against the corporate cynicism that had nearly consumed her soul. Connor studied the weathered face in the picture, noting the same determined kindness he'd seen in Olivia when she'd faced down her own board of directors to save a town full of strangers who'd become family. "I think he sent you here to remember who you were supposed to be before the world convinced you that success meant accumulating power instead of using it wisely." The answer felt true in the way that simple statements sometimes contain entire philosophies about how to live without losing sight of what makes life worth living. Mia's latest drawing hung on the refrigerator alongside school permission slips and grocery lists and all the domestic debris that accumulates when people build lives together one day at a time. The picture depicted a family tree with branches extending in both directions through time, connecting past and future through shared values that transcended individual circumstances. Grandfather's workshop in Chicago connected to Connor's garage in Cedar Falls, which stretched toward whatever future Mia would build with the tools and wisdom they were teaching her about the importance of fixing things instead of throwing them away when they broke. Love stories, Connor had learned, weren't just about couples finding each other across impossible odds. They were about communities choosing to care for one another across differences of background, wealth, and circumstance that might otherwise divide people into categories that prevented real connection. Some relationships didn't require legal definitions or formal ceremonies, just the daily decision to show up for each other when showing up mattered most, and the courage to believe that tomorrow might be better than today if enough people committed to making it so. The evening breeze carried scents of motor oil and possibility, the same wind that had once blown across Iowa farmland to carry grandfather's dreams eastward, now bringing his granddaughter's heart home to a place she'd never known she was searching for until she found it in the kindness of strangers who became family. Connor reached for Olivia's hand as stars appeared overhead, the same constellation Sarah had taught him to identify, now watching over a family that had grown rather than replaced what came before, proving that hearts could expand to hold new love without diminishing what had been precious about the past. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices, but tonight held the perfect peace of people who'd learned that home isn't a place marked on maps or described in real estate listings. It's wherever people decide to build something together that's larger than the sum of their individual dreams, stronger than their separate fears, and more lasting than any corporate acquisition or development project designed to transform communities into profit margins. In the distance, the Cedar River flowed toward whatever future awaited them all, carrying stories of love and loss and redemption toward tomorrow's possibilities, like messages in bottles that would wash ashore wherever people were ready to believe in second chances and the healing power of choosing each other when choosing seemed impossible.